Alright everybody, so this is part 3 of the series I'm doing on Japanese, well, pre-modern Japanese history from prehistory to 1868. So in this video, we're going to be talking a little bit about Buddhism and also about the Kofun period and what's sometimes called the Kofun Revolution in Japan. So just as a quick summary of the past, two videos, the Yayoi period, or the Yayoi phase, Yayoi Jidai, whatever term you want to use for it, was Japan's first major agricultural phase. So at its earliest starting point, the archaeology puts the development of mass agriculture, especially wet rice agriculture, at around 1000 BCE, or BC if you want to use that dating nomenclature, definitely by 300 BCE, and it goes up until about 300 CE in the Japanese islands. So this time period roughly corresponds to the two Han dynasties on the mainland in China. So the two Han dynasties are the Western and Eastern, which is how you'll usually see them presented. Sometimes they're the early and late Han dynasties, but they run roughly the same, time period. And this is very important for the development of the Kofun period because it's from the mainland, so predominantly China, but also Korea, that Japan gets a lot of its intellectual and a lot of its philosophical and, in general, its cultural makeup. Much of it comes from the mainland, and it's in this period that this really starts to happen. So when the Han Dynasty is established, it conquers the Korean Peninsula, more or less. Not all of it, but a decent chunk of it. And the Han establish, these are technically called commanderies. Really, we should think of them more like outposts and frontier zones that are basically under military garrison. So it is through these political areas that Chinese technology and philosophical ideas slowly begins to filter into Japan via trade and diplomatic missions, religious study missions, things like that. So going along with all this, we have a primary source from about 297 CE. This is the Records of Wei, or the Book of Wei. And in the previous video, I had mentioned Queen Himiko. So this is the main primary source we have for the description of not only Queen Himiko, but also many of ancient Japan's small little political units. And what's striking about the Book of Wei is it records around 40, give or take a few, of these small political units. So these are not necessarily like large-scale states or large-scale civilizations that we may typically think of when we hear the word state. But these are units. These are political units probably based around at least one town, perhaps more. Maybe there's a few confederacies, but these are small units. But very, very quickly, the Chinese and the Korean primary sources that do talk about the Japanese islands, and then eventually the early Japanese texts that we have, start giving us a different picture. It starts giving us a picture of increased state formation and increased political development in the Japanese islands. So going along with the development of this new political group, or these new political groupings in the Japanese islands, is the emergence of a new kind of class of individual. So the Sinosphere, by which I mean the area traditionally culturally dominated by China. So China itself, certainly North Vietnam, certainly what is today, northern Thailand and northern Laos. So chunks of Southeast Asia, and India overlaps a little bit in this area too, but chunks of Southeast Asia, chunks of what are today Tibet, chunks of what are today Western China, definitely Korea, a little bit of the steppe. So this is like the general area of Chinese cultural dominance. the military is important to state formation and the development of states, but not to the extent that the military takes in Japan. So in the mainland, the crucial social grouping, the crucial social class, if class is even the right word to use, and status group might be the better one. We'll talk about this later when we get into the Tokugawa period. But on the mainland, it's not the military that holds sway over things. It's the learned nobility, so monks, scholars, people like that. Initially, because Japan is taking a lot of stuff from the mainland, especially from China, initially, in Japan, it is the intelligentsia that has the upper hand, but very quickly, the military starts coming up in their own power. And eventually, that military develops their own unique brand of warrior, the samurai. So Japan is unique in this regard as far as East Asian history and East Asian culture is concerned. Now, it's during the next period after the Yayoi phase that we see, again, increased development of state formation in Japan. Specifically, we move into a period called the Kofun era. Okay, so in blue, I have these two sets of dates. So between about 300 and 700 CE, this is roughly the time period when all these large-scale tombs are being constructed. So between 300 and 700, roughly 400-year stretch, is what's typically called the Kofun era. Roughly contemporaneous with this, so about 250 to about 710, is the rise of the Yamato Confederacy. So the Yamato family is the clan that does eventually emerge and develop in central Honshu, so the main Japanese island, into what is today the imperial family of Japan. So what we see in this period is that in these tombs there is burial homogeneity. So prior to the rise of the Yamato Confederacy, all of these different families, we're going to talk about this in a minute, all these different major clans and all these different major families in Japan have artifacts that are sacred or important to them in some way, shape, or form that are not sacred or important to another clan or another family. So this might be a certain kind of sword. This might be, insert object here. A piece of jewelry, maybe a stone carved in a certain way, maybe a certain kind of ceramic, stuff like that. During the rise of the Yamato family, however, what we see in the archaeology is that the things that are sacred to the Yamato family, so swords, jewels, and mirrors, which supersede bells, and we'll talk about this in a sec, these are the things that are sacred to the Yamato family. And gradually, as they build their power, what we see in the grave goods of the other major clans and other major families in ancient Japan is the deposition in the archaeology of goods that are sacred to the Yamato. So what we can infer from this is that the Yamato largely emerge and they gain power through not necessarily, or what does not necessarily look like, outright militaristic conquest of other groups. They gain power by bringing in and incorporating other clans and other families from Japan. And because the Yamato is the most powerful, they give those now less powerful families political and social legitimacy to continue ruling where they rule by bestowing them with the goods and the objects that are sacred to the Yamato. So you see in green here, I have Shotoku. So these are those bell-shaped things that are in the photograph furthest to the left. And then there are mirrors. So these are the circular objects. It's not really clear where the dividing line is, but the archaeology of Eastern Japan, and this is still something that is being fought over, but will probably eventually be decided as we get more sites uncovered. Somewhere in ancient Japan, there is a cultural divide where a chunk of the Japanese islands and the people living there praise, place great store by these Shotoku, by these bells. So these are not only used in like Yayoi period settlements. If an enemy's coming near or something, you hit it with a hammer and you ring the bell to alert everybody. But these also appear to have had a sacred or religious aspect to them. And the other chunk of the Japanese islands that have bronze working in this period, because not all of it does, but the other chunk of the Japanese islands that have bronze working appear to have held these mirrors, many of which appear to have come from the mainland. So we have, again, this Chinese and Korean influence on ancient Japan in the same regard. Certainly the Yamato hold the mirror in that regard, and gradually the mirror begins to overtake the bell. So that's where the mirror thing comes in here. The sword also comes in, and lastly we have the jewels. Okay, so what is this jewel? Well, you see in the bottom right hand, I have these comma-shaped bead things. So these are Magatama beads. These are what appear to have been the sacred jewels, or what we think are the sacred jewels anyway. Nobody really knows officially what that looks like with the imperial family, because the 3 sacred treasures of the imperial family, the sword was lost. So there is a replacement sword. There was a mirror, and the imperial family, to my knowledge, still today has the sacred jewels, but nobody's allowed to look at them because it's related to the sacred family. But we find these Magatama beads in all these different tombs and archaeological sites, so we're assuming that that's what that jewel is. So if you're like looking at it and you say, oh, it kind of looks like a seed. Yeah, it is a seed. It's what it's crafted to look like. So the best way we can probably interpret this stuff, and the reason why these are sacred, is that they may potentially have had something to do, or may potentially have had some kind of cultural or symbolic significance prior to the rise of mass agriculture. And then after the rise of mass agriculture, the Yamato family takes these objects, which were sacred to people before they came into power, and use them to gain legitimacy for themselves, and then give them to their supporters. So you see kind of how this is working. However, going along with all of this, we have this problem in political anthropology and archaeology, specifically the archaeology of state formation, is, well, okay, we have this group of people, a clan or whatever, and their retainers, that is not necessarily all that strange. Humans tend to break themselves up into tribes. This just appears to be like the original way we've done things. And then they start growing food. So when you have settled agriculture, well, you need to be near that settled agriculture to protect your food supply and take care of it and harvest it. So you build permanent dwellings nearby. So houses, maybe there's an enemy in the area, so you fortify it. Maybe you build like a dirt rampart or something. So you're starting to develop some kind of a village or something that looks like a village. This is a localized political unit. A big problem in political anthropology and archaeology, and this is a big issue with ancient Japan as well, or any area really, is, so we have this village thing, and it keeps growing over time. At what point does that become a state? It's not necessarily always clear. In ancient Japan, this is something that is still being fought over in the literature, and I've mentioned before, we're going to do a more in-depth look at this in the bigger series I have planned. So we'll talk more about what exactly constitutes a state as far as the archaeology is concerned there, but just be aware that this is still something of a problem in ancient Japanese studies. Now, as the Yamato family and the Yamato Confederacy is slowly growing and gaining power, they're coming into contact with different clans and different tribes of people. So the ancient Japanese texts record these political units and these social units as being under the overall heading of Uji. So, Uji, there are 13 of them. Sometimes they get translated as clan. That maybe is not the best way of doing it. Clan suggests that you have some kind of a concrete idea about who you are, what your relationship is to each other. So, the Uji are a little more loosely organized. There's a appear to have been a core kind of kernel unit inside the Uji of like a centralized family. But then there's a whole bunch of other people and a whole bunch of other social units attached to them. So lineage has been proposed maybe as a better way of understanding what Uji really is. For our purposes in this video, I'm just going to use clan because that's something we're all familiar with. But as the imperial family is developing, as the Yamato family is developing, it comes into contact with these different Uji. Now, if you read the ancient Japanese texts, this is where it gets interesting. A couple of different things stand out. There are, or appears to have been, a large amount of the older literature used to translate this as corporation. It's not a corporation. The word in the ancient Japanese text is bei. So bei are social units. Sometimes they're distinct clans or uji, which take on certain social or political functions or jobs in the overall scheme of things. So the mononobe, so that word bei, was the social unit. It was the uji which predominantly formed the military and the imperial guard unit of the ancient Yamato family. So these were the clan that basically protected the imperial line. There are other bei which are known for being craftsmen, being smith, stuff like that. So a lot of these bei appear to have come over from Korea. So there's a big migration from the Korean peninsula of people coming into the Japanese island. So that's very clear from the ancient Japanese texts. The other things that are very clear from the ancient Japanese texts are that there was a lot of fighting. The other things that are clear are that some of the names of ancient Japanese emperors, assuming they weren't just made up, don't really look to be all that Japanese. Some of them are Japanese. Others, though, appear to have what looks like maybe a Korean tint, shall we say, to the name. This is maybe not that surprising given the close contacts that ancient Japan had with ancient Korean kingdoms, especially Paekche, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then the last thing you notice, well, the last two things you notice is that the official imperial history states that the imperial family comes out of central Honshu, so the main Japanese island. There's another story, though, that some of the Japanese come into Honshu via the east, so from Kyushu, and they come with war and conquest. So there's a problem here with this. And then there's also the matter of, well, we have Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who is sacred to the imperial family, but there are two other deities, the god of the moon and the god of the storms. So tornadoes, earthquakes, thunder, that kind of thing. It's not really clear how much more powerful Amaterasu is here. So what all this maybe has led some scholars to suggest is that, well, maybe Himiko is not written into the ancient Japanese texts, and maybe there are all these problems because maybe, if we go back far enough, the Yamato clan is not as clean-cut as it maybe appears to be. There is what's called the change of dynasties theory, which is exactly what it sounds like. It suggests maybe that because of all these issues in ancient Japanese texts and, that maybe the Yamato family has gained power by overthrowing two other original imperial families. Or maybe the Yamato family was taken over to a degree by other clans. So there's an issue with, well, how exactly does this family develop? There are some who would argue that maybe there is more of a Korean origin to this than we would perhaps at first think. This is anathema to hardcore modern-day Japanese nationalists, and in a way, a lot of the literature is not fully settled on this argument, and it still continues to rage, mainly because there are imperial tombs that we just can't open because they are related to the imperial family, and the Japanese government doesn't really allow us to do that. But I just want to make you aware that there are problems with tracing the original origins of the Yamato family. Now, we can break up the Kofun into old, middle, and new periods. So the old Kofun period has about 10,000 of these tombs, and I'm going to show you a picture of them in a minute. But there's about 10,000 tombs from the old period. About half of the occupants, and this is where it gets interesting, at least as far as I'm concerned, I think it's interesting. About half the occupants of these tombs, so approximately 5,000, let's say, are female. So this goes back to the ancient Japanese way of doing things, where it looks like it was more of a matriarchal society, and maybe this changes with the impact of Chinese culture and Korean culture, which is more patriarchal. About half of the warriors in these tombs also appear to have been female, although I would be careful with this. There is no way to deny the genetics of and the bone structure of a person buried in a tomb. We know half these people are female. However, burial goods and grave goods, these are things which can potentially mean something to a culture very, very different in death than they can mean in life. So just because, and this is not necessarily true across the board, but just because somebody is buried with a sword or an axe or spear or some other kind of weapon or armor does not necessarily mean that that person should be viewed as a warrior. It is entirely possible that those grave goods can mean something very different when they are deposited in the ground rather than used on a battlefield. However, at the same time, the lack of any explanatory text leaves this up for, continual debate. But women appear to have been powerful even in this period, and they appear to have controlled access to vital resources like iron and bronze working technology. And it's also during the old Kofun period that we have improved iron and bronze working technology come over from the Korean peninsula. So we have better tools, more irrigation, we have cultivation, which allows increased food supply. So there's more people, so political states are able to grow more complex, and therefore the tombs and other large structures are able to grow larger and more complex over time. It is in the middle to late Kofun period, really that until about 300 CE, most of the political units are not that big, maybe 100 to 150 square kilometers or miles, and they're ruled by chieftains. Now, the most important chieftains, the most important area is the Kinai region. So I have this outlined on this little map of Japan I have here. So the area inside the white box is basically what's the central Honshu. That is the area where the Yamato family, so what the clan that develops into the imperial family of Japan, is initially from. This is where the Ise shrine is from. This is where a lot of big deal religious elements and religious shrines in Japanese culture are located. And this is where the original Kofun that the Yamato deposit their sacred goods into, so the swords, the mirrors, the jewels, the Magatama beads, etc. This is where a lot of that develops, and this is where a lot of those grave goods kind of spread out from. So between 300 and about 645, the Kinai chieftains build these large Kofuns, these large keyhole-shaped tombs, and I'll show you a picture in 1 minute of what these things look like. By 400, these tombs are found from southern Kyushu, so the westernmost Japanese island, all the way to roughly northern Honshu. Between about 500 and 645, the Yamato in Kinai developed rapidly, and the argument for what's been called the Kofun period revolution, this period of massive rapid Japanese state development in the Kinai region and expanding outward, is through increased contact and increased cultural exchanges with the mainland. Because, and we're going to get more into this when we get to Buddhism, the Chinese and the Koreans are giving the Yamato family things like Buddhism, things like Confucianism, and Japanese Chinese rather, methods of statecraft, things that are valid and legitimate owing to their age. And the Japanese are using these things to construct a much more powerful state. So I say that these things are large keyhole-shaped tombs. Well, what exactly do these look like? So what you are looking at here is one of the largest kofun ever built in Japan. So the kofun, like we've gone over, these large keyhole-shaped tombs, and these are literally large keyhole-shaped tombs. These potentially originate in the Korean peninsula. It's not really clear. There are things that look like them in Korea, but we don't really know if they come over in that manner and then are improved upon. It's not fully clear. But my point with this, for this chunk of the video, is that if you look at this picture, so this is from Osaka in Japan, the thing that surrounds this kofun, the thing that surrounds this tomb, is a city. So, in the modern day, we are all familiar with how large houses are, and apartment buildings, and roads, and things like that. So, these things are dwarfed by this kofun. So, this is a massive structure. So, what do you need to build one of these things? I mean, constructing a kofun, or a keyhole-shaped tomb like this. And by the way, these things are very large and slanted. They go up for sometimes several hundred feet. These are not easy things to build. I mean, look, so you have the central kofun, you have the central tomb, and then there's water around it, or what used to be water, now it looks like it's kind of filled in by grass, and then there is an outer layer, and then beyond that outer layer, there's even another outer boundary. So to build these things, you need a lot of labor, and it's very labor intensive. It takes potentially years to go do this. So to build one of these things, what it reflects from the society that constructs it is that they are politically very advanced. They are able to marshal the resources to feed everybody. They are able to marshal enough people to either pay taxes to pay people to go build this, or their population's big enough to have corvée labor, where basically during the non-growing season, farmers and others go out and they build and they work on public works projects or tombs or things like that in lieu of actually paying taxes. So you have a large population, and you have the military and political ability to impose your will over large groups of people. So every place where this thing develops, every place where this thing shows up in Japan, it shows up alongside an increasing power structure among not only the Yamato family, but along local clans that get co-opted into the Yamato Confederacy. So this really reflects a growing power on the part of Japanese and on the part of Japanese state formation. So it's during the rise of the Yamato Confederacy and during the high and late Kofun period, when the Yamato Confederacy is slowly gaining control over Japan, that we start getting changes to the way the Japanese do things. So if you watched the previous video on Queen Himiko, then you know that, and I'll cover it here briefly just as a reminder, the Japanese appear to have been a relatively matriarchal society. There appears to have been evidence of co-gendered rulership, maybe some dual king and queenship. Male and female kings and queens govern together. So what we have here is, in anthropological kinship terms, this is called bilateral structures, and we have bilateral kinship structures. So in ancient Japan, you trace your lineage potentially from both mother and father, perhaps more so from the mother, if the society is a little more matriarchal. But my point with this is that in ancient Japan, prior to the arrival of continental influences, women had a much higher status in ancient Japanese society. Well, a lot of the ancient Japanese mythology and folklore slowly coalesces into what we know today as Shinto, the way of the gods. Shinto is a faith that is relatively decentralized. It's also difficult to describe. Thus, we have the importance of this continental religion, Buddhism. So, you're looking in the bottom right-hand corner here of a map of ancient Korea. So there were the three Korean kingdoms, Goguryeo, Paekche, and Silla. Gaya is this weird kind of confederacy that may or may not be Korean or Japanese. There are issues with it. But the kingdom of Silla is very closely allied with China. The kingdom of Paekche is very closely allied with the ancient Yamato state. And in about the 530s or the 550s, a bunch of guys from Paekche show up at the Yamato court, and they have a couple different things. They have they have gifts for the Yamato, so swords. They have diplomatic envoys. They have a statue of the Buddha, and the Japanese are looking at the gift and like, okay, we know what most of this is. What's that? What is the statue of a man that you brought with you? We don't know what that is, because the kami don't have, in the modern day, all the kami have statues and paintings of them and stuff. This doesn't happen until after Buddhism shows up, really. So when the Koreans come over and they have a little statue of the Buddha, the Japanese don't really know what that is, because their religion doesn't do that. So the Korean envoys have this little note, this little piece of paper from the king of Paekche, and he says to the head of the Yamato, this doctrine, meaning Buddhism, is amongst all doctrines the most excellent. So Buddhism is really cool. You should give it a try. But it's also difficult to explain, and it's hard to comprehend. Okay, so Buddhism is interesting. It has power, but there are issues with it. This doctrine can create religious merit and retribution without measure and without bonds, and so lead on to a full appreciation of the highest wisdom. Every prayer is fulfilled and naught is wanting. So, the introduction of Buddhism to Japan in this period gives the Yamato an external source of power, an external source of religious and cultural legitimacy that they can use to build up their own power base. But the problem is that not all of the Japanese really like this. So the Yamato, and every major clan really in ancient Japan, these guys all have a founding deity. They have an ancestral god or kami that they all claim descent from. So for the Yamato, they get their authority, they get their right to govern Japan because they are related to Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun. That foundation myth gives them an ancestral claim to authority. They have the ability through this divine ancestry to avert misfortune, to gain good fortune, so they have what eventually looks like, good karma. Buddhism, though, because it's an alternate religion, it's an alternate way of doing things, it reflects an alternative route to godly power and thus political legitimacy. So this presents a problem because it gives the Yamato not only an alternative, route to divine power, but it gives other people in Japan a divine route to power and political legitimacy. So this is going to come to a head in a little while. In Buddhism, there are sutras, there are sacred ceremonies, and Buddhism has what appear to the Japanese to be divine secrets. So it gets attractive to a lot of people because it presents an alternative method of creating power. And Buddhism is founded really on three fundamental premises that ancient Japanese religion and mythology doesn't necessarily have. There is the idea of impermanence, this idea that everything changes, always. You never step into the same stream twice kind of thing. There is universal suffering. And then there is fate. Everything is subjected to the law of karma. So you can't just do something because, I'm the king, so I can go do this. No, in Buddhism, if you do something bad, that reflects poorly on you, and then when you die and you are reincarnated, because you were not a good person in the previous life, you will not ascend to the next plane. You will go down a step, or you may just be reborn into the same plane. So the whole idea, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the whole idea with Buddhism is to ascend to this realm called nirvana, where it's not really heaven, you just achieve peace. if you behave or you misbehave, that's going to impact how closely and how quickly you get there. So by the time Buddhism reaches Japan through the envoys coming from Paekche, it's already over 1,000 years old, and the Koreans and the Chinese use it. So because it's so old and because it's used by China, it is looked at as a faith and as a political institution that is legitimate in a way that the Japanese ways of doing things are not. So, because we're talking about Buddhism, let's do a little bit of an overview here. So, what is Buddhism? It develops in South Asia, and it develops out of ancient yogic tradition. So, if you read like a world history textbook for an introductory college class or for high school or something like that, you may be familiar with the idea that Buddhism develops out of another South Asian religion. Well, two South Asian religions, Jainism and Hinduism. This is not wrong. It is just not the full picture. So, this thing we call Hinduism, in many ways, exists in South Asia, but it does not fully become structured as a religion really until around the year 1000 and moving forward. Buddhism is significantly older than the year 1000. So it's developing out of things that will eventually become Hinduism, but at the time it's really developing out of just these local or regional yogic traditions and local traditions, which probably to an extent go back into the Stone Age. So Buddhism, and this area in general, really has a tradition of ascetics who gain great personal control over themselves through various practices, like very intensive meditation. So one of the things we're going to talk about later on is the development of Zen Buddhism. So Zen Buddhism, anyone that practices this knows what I'm talking about, is intellectually rigorous and to a degree intellectually painful, because the whole idea is that, well, you want to reach the next plane of existence. You want to achieve this area of nirvana, this being of just complete peace, so that you don't have this continual suffering in life. Well, to reach it takes enlightenment. To reach it takes a lot of effort. So Zen Buddhist meditation has you meditate on things called koans. These are things that are, at first, they appear to be nonsensical. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? That kind of thing, where I can do this, two hands, and it makes noise. But this, one hand clapping, makes no noise. Well, Zen Buddhism, you're supposed to meditate on what that means, what that sounds like, and then gradually you will, so the idea goes, you will have a breakthrough through sheer mental discipline, and you will achieve enlightenment, and you will be able to go up in the next stage of doing things. So that's one of the things that Zen Buddhism and other branches of Buddhism also emphasize. Well, how does this develop? Like I said, a lot of Buddhism and these meditative practices potentially go back into the Stone Age. So anybody that hunts knows that depending on what you are hunting, you have to remain very still. If you move too much, whatever game you're hunting is going to flee because you're making too much noise. So to do it correctly, you have to remain still enough that you're able to let the animals come within your range. And prior to firearms, you have a bow or maybe a spear, so the range you have to get to an animal is significantly closer than what we have nowadays. So you have to remain still enough to do that, but you can't be still enough and inactive enough that you fall asleep. So you have to have what appears to be, from a Buddhist or a Hindu perspective, a waking, meditative stance. So this is how a lot of this stuff in Buddhism and what becomes Hinduism develops. It comes out of practices of hunting, etc., standing watch, so your friends don't get eaten by the wild animal. This is where a lot of this stuff comes from. Before Buddhism, so Buddhism inherits this. There is already a tradition in South Asia of a vast universe, of rebirth, of this idea of nirvana or moksha. So this idea that life is suffering, and that eventually, through good karma, you can eventually attain the realm of nirvana or moksha, depending on how you define it, where there, like I said, this is not really heaven, it's not really good or pure, it simply is. It's a realm where there is no suffering. So all this stuff Buddhism is inheriting. Now the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, lived somewhere in the north of India, probably nearer to what is today Nepal. And so the story goes, he's a prince. And he's not allowed to leave the imperial palace, and he's not allowed to leave the sacred gardens. But one day he does. And he starts encountering everything else that we associate with pain and suffering in life. So sick people, death, etc. And he says, this is horrible. This is awful. And he goes on this journey to figure out how to end this, how to end suffering, because life should not be lived in such a manner. So eventually, he develops a method of achieving nirvana, or at least setting yourself on the path to achieving nirvana. And he becomes Buddha. He becomes enlightened. So what is this practice where, the Buddha develops all these ideas? And the ideas he develops are called the middle way. And the middle way is based around the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism is that, life is suffering. Life is awful. Suffering has a cause. That cause is wanting things. So we suffer because we are dissatisfied with our current lot in life. And if we can strive and achieve something better, well then great. But if we don't, then your life is just suffering because you never attained what you wanted, and your life is not going to be lived to the fullest extent. Number three, the third of these Four Noble Truths, is that, life is suffering. Suffering is a cause, but we can end suffering by stopping wanting. Now, to stop wanting, number 4 in the Four Noble Truths, is to follow the Eightfold Path. So you have to live with right intentions, right views, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So these are all ways to give up attachment and to give up the whole idea of wanting something out of life. You must accept life simply as it is, and then live your life simply as it comes to you. So with all of this comes the law of karma. So karma is this law of cause and effect, where what you experience currently in your life is due to past actions in past lives. So to end suffering, you want to reach nirvana. Well, eventually you get there through a system of reincarnation. And depending on how you behave in life, when you die and you're reincarnated, it depends where you're going to go. You can ascend up the ladder and get one step closer to achieving peace. Or you can go down the ladder and live a more terrible reincarnated life. So by the time this religion reaches Japan, it had gone through India, it had gone through Tibet, it had gone through Southeast Asia and China and Korea. So by the time it reaches Japan, it is fully developed, more or less, in terms of a religion with a doctrine, in terms of a philosophy, in terms of a way to prop up states. And when it reaches Japan, Buddhist ritual and Buddhist ceremony has a lot of art to it. It has a lot of music. It has incense. It has... Buddhism is awe-inspiring, less in the sense of, oh, dude, that's awesome, that's cool, and more in the sense of, oh my god. That is, like, you're slack-jawed from looking at this. And the Japanese view it as very awe-inspiring, because the traditional way of doing, worship in Japan is very simple. You clap your hands, you wave your hands, maybe you chant a little bit, you dance. When Buddhism comes in, there's all these statues, there's incense, or there's like a smell to it. Buddhist priests have the ability to invoke magic rituals. There is a Sangha, the community of believers, so there's a system of creating monasteries, etc. There's a lot of music, there's art, So it's very awe-inspiring to the Japanese and to the Yamato state. So they're very interested in this. But, like I said, not all the Japanese really want this. When Buddhism comes over from Paekche, the Japanese court considers if it should really introduce Buddhism, a foreign deity, into its pantheon. The introduction of Buddhism was supported by a clan, the Soga. So the Soga have, or appear to have had, Korean connections. So because they're connected to the mainland, they have the ability to get just cultural contacts and cultural goods from the mainland in ways that other Japanese clans can't. So things like ironworking, etc. But they are opposed by another Japanese clan, the Mononobe. So the Mononobe are the clan that largely is responsible for the defense of the imperial family. And around this period, around the 530s, 540s, 550s-ish, a lot of things start going wrong in Japan. There are diseases, there appears to have been massive crop failure, etc. So the Mononobe and the people that are opposed to Buddhism are like, nah, no, not this. They set stuff on fire, they destroy statues of the Buddha, they burn temples, they throw an image of the Buddha into a canal or a river, depending on what you read. This is possibly related to these really weird weather conditions around 535, 536, but my point is that there is a civil war between these guys, and the Soga come out on top. And in the 550s, the Soga's influence grows over the Yamato clan to the point that they're basically able to construct marriage alliances with the imperial family, where Soga daughters marry Japanese emperors, and then the daughters of these emperors, and then the sons and daughters of these emperors have Soga mothers, so they're all very closely intertwined with the Soga clan. So the Soga clan develops a very, very tight hold over the early Yamato Confederacy. They never overthrow them because it's useful to have a figurehead in place, but really it's the Soga who start pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, around the same time that all of this stuff is happening, there is a Yamato prince. His name is Prince Shotoku. And Shotoku is crucial here because, yeah, the Soga like Buddhism, but as the big guys on the block, it's the imperial family that really has to decide this one way or the other. So Shotoku is a Yamato prince who is very favorable to Buddhism. He really likes the idea. So it's under his patronage and the Soga patronage that Buddhism is really introduced into Japan. Now, going along with all this, Shotoku looks at the Chinese way of doing things, and he starts importing some Chinese stuff. He develops a constitution, although whether or not that's really a full-fledged constitution is debated. But they start using the Chinese term emperor. Eventually this becomes the Japanese term tenno. Shotoku looked at Chinese Confucianism. He thinks it's a very interesting idea. He feels it would be useful to help develop the Yamato state, so he brings that over. But the problem is that in bringing Chinese goods over and bringing Chinese institutions over, you bring in a patriarchal system of doing things. So going forward, there's going to be a lot of issues with how Japan sets up those societies and how exactly the court aristocracy does things. This is going to be a running theme throughout the Heian period, which is going to come next. And it's also during all of this that the emperor reduces the power of the Uji. And towards the end of the Kofun period, he integrates the Uji into a Chinese-style court and a Chinese style of developing a state. So it's through cultural influences coming from mainland East Asia that the Kofun Revolution happens, and that we gradually start getting this thing that we can really look at and say, yes, this is the state of ancient Japan. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to move with this a little more and keep going into the Heian period, and then eventually talk about the rise of the samurai and the Genpei War.